This video is tailored very much to Linux development while using Windows as a host operating system. There are many other ways to achieve ESP-IDF development, but that's the way we'll be talking about here. Because of that, the prerequisites are 16 gigabytes of RAM, VMware, Windows 10 or higher, and a fast drive with at least 256 gigabytes of space. SSD is going to qualify as a fast drive. For the record, virtual machines are very hard on drives, so that's why you need a quick one. Virtual machines do have a reputation for wearing out SSDs more quickly as well. I've never had a problem with that, and I've been running virtual machines on SSDs for years and years, but there does appear to be some truth to that, so be advised. I recommend using Linux rather than Windows for this kind of development. Windows seems to have come a long way, and probably it's just fine, but I have developed a workflow using Linux, and that's what I'm going to show you here. In particular, I like the root Debian distribution from the people who directly make Debian, as you can see on the screen. Ubuntu is fine, Kali Linux is fine. I'm not going to vouch for them, but I'm sure they'll work just the same. But this is going to show you Debian. So the first thing we have to do is download our Debian image. And I do recommend downloading the full image and not one of the more abbreviated download then download again images. And if that sounds complicated, don't worry about it. I'm saying download a big, massive install image, and that's what we're going to do. So what we do is we go to the Debian download page, and down here, kind of in the middle, you have this larger complete installation image. And then down here, you have these torrents. So go back up here, complete installation image. And then you want to download using HTTP. They're a little big. It'll take a little while, but it's not really so bad. And I prefer the DVD image over here. It has a little more stuff in it, a little easier. And chances are you're on what we call AMD 64, which is pretty much going to be like, you know, an AMD or a Core i, whatever, processor. If you might be on an ARM, you'll know if you are. Yeah, but when in doubt, this is the one you want. And then we're going to download this guy right here. So this will take a little while. So I'm going to go ahead and let that download. And if you're using Chrome, you'll see, you know, this little progress bar telling you what you're up to. So I'm going to pause the video here, and when it finishes downloading, we will resume. Okay, we're back. It is finally downloaded. So what we're going to do is a kind of an intermediate step. There you can see the image. It's in my downloads area. A lot of us have more than one drive, and this image is kind of big. It's 4 gig, and maybe you have like a terabyte drive or whatever. But this is more or less an archive after we're done. You probably want to keep it, and it's big, and it doesn't need to be on a fast drive. So what I like to do is I like to put it on my NAS, which is just a really big networked drive. And you don't need like a whole NAS, but you know, some kind of external drive, if you have it, that's bigger for storage is where you're going to want to put this thing. So that's what I'm going to do. And if you don't have that, just leave it right there on your C drive. After we finish using this image, it's optional to keep it around. I like to. As you can see, I keep old distros around just because I'm, you know, an IT guy and I like to have everything available. You don't really have to do that. And now we're going to the point where we're ready to begin the new virtual machine in which our Debian install is going to live. So we will begin by new virtual machine, and I like to use VMware. You certainly don't have to. You can use something like Parallels, or I believe Oracle's got VirtualBox, and I'm sure there's others. And every virtual machine system, hosting system, I'm going to call it, has their own little caveats. So while I'm sure you're going to be able to make it work, it'll probably be a little bit different, the details, versus what I'm going to show you here. So I like VMware. I recommend it. It's, for me, the easiest, and that's what we're going to do. I do like to use the custom advanced, so that's what I'm going to do here. We're going to use the newest workstation compatibility mode. And now we're going to say we're going to actually install from a particular image. And, you know, this thing remembers that I've installed off my NAS before. so it kind of can find where it's at. And this step is going to be unique to your system. Wherever you downloaded and put that ISO that we downloaded earlier, you're going to have to point it. And typically it does say it can detect the operating system. So that's a little unusual, but we can accommodate that. So it will be Linux, and we're going to tell it that it's Debian. It likes that. Now, our Debian is much newer than Debian 10. However, Debian 10 will be just fine. And you'll want to make sure your location is on a fast, spacious drive. That is a prerequisite. And for me, I'm going to put it on my NAS, which is unusual. Most people should not put it on their NAS, because I have an enterprise level NAS that is ridiculously fast, and most people do not, because it's not worth it for most people, really. So you will probably want to put this on your C drive, provided you have enough space. So I'm going to give this a unique name. We'll probably want to call this like ESP-IDF development environment. In fact, let's do that. We'll call this ESP-IDF dev, okay? And you'll want to match this up. It doesn't have to be exactly the same, but recognizably similar. In my case, I'll just make it the same. And I recommend 2 and 2 here. You don't need like a ton of processor dedicated, because C++ and ESP-IDF, they don't really tax the system super hard, but you are going to want you're going to want more than just 2 cores. So 4 is plenty. And Linux is pretty lightweight, so I'm going to be generous. I'm going to give it 8, gig. You probably get away with less, really, but just for this example, I'll give it 8. And this step bears a whole different conversation that we won't go into here. It's a big one. You could do NAT, and NAT is, like I said, its own conversation. And you can make that work, but I like to use bridged. And the short version of that story is, by using bridged, a lot of computers on your network can see the virtual machine. And since I have a lot of computers I like to access virtual machines from, bridged is very useful. So that's what I recommend you do. And stick with that recommendation there. Stick with that recommendation. And we're going to create a new virtual disk. And funny enough, Debian tends to fill up pretty fast. Start small. So I would give it 256 gigabytes. VMs are such that you don't have to allocate all the space now. I like to call it sparse. So you're kind of telling it, to abuse the term, virtually how big your drive's going to be, but when you start out, it's only going to be like 10 gig. It's not going to actually take all 256. So there's very little penalty to specifying a big size here. So you could even go higher. In fact, because of what I just said, I will go higher, because it's not going to occupy that much space. And splitting the disk gives it a little more performance, but I like one single file, just because for me, it's easier to manage one file versus a ton of them. And I think for most people, that's going to be the case, especially if you're on an SSD, and 90% chance you are on an SSD. In this, you can keep the default name. Okay, so we are pretty much good to go. I like to do a quick check, make sure the operating system is what you want it to be, make sure the hard disk is what you want it to be, and then the other ones you can adjust later. Although it's best if you don't adjust your 4 CPU cores. Depending on the version of VMware and the version of operating system you're installing, this can get pretty ornery if you change it later. It's improved. The chances of it getting ornery are much reduced than the old days, but the chance is still there. So it's gone through the initial create process. So your VM is kind of this bare, empty virtual machine now, with nothing really in it yet, but it's ready for you to start putting things in it. Part of our previous steps specified where the install image comes from, and it still remembers that. And that's instrumental now, because when we start the virtual machine, it's going to start from that install image. So here we go. So we see the Debian 12 install image, and we'll use the graphical install. We don't have to be all macho and use the text install. It's not that important. And it's a topic for a different video, the depths of Debian, the depths of all the different things you can install, what they do. We're not going to go into any of that. I'm only going to keep it succinct as to the things that are particularly relevant for the development environment that we're setting up. Naturally, we're speaking English, so that's what I'm going to choose. I'm in the United States, so I'm going to choose that. More English. Debian's auto-detecting some things here. So here we are at the Debian hostname choice, and it's exactly what you would think. You're naming your machine here. And so I'm going to call this Debian ESP. You can name it whatever you like. Just be sure that it doesn't really collide with other names of computers on your network. And we will press continue, and we can press continue here. That doesn't matter. And of course, here's just traditional username and password stuff. So I'm just going to type in Debian, which is a terrible password, but you should choose a good password. Okay, and I'm going to choose just my name. This is just up to you, whatever name you want. And similar to what I said just a moment ago, the other one was specifically the admin password. This is your user password, and the same kind of thing goes. Your user is going to have less privileges than the admin, but you don't want to just leave it wide open, despite the fact this is an isolated VM. So I'm going to do, for this example, I'm just going to type in Debian again, but you will want a proper password. Okay. And I'm in Pacific time zone. I think this is pretty self-evident what to do. So this part can be a little technical. What I like to do, I really like LVM. It's technical, but if you do just the regular wizard-based LVM, it's no more technical than the regular one. And LVM has some really neat features that if you really dig into it, I think you may enjoy. And let it go ahead and do the whole thing. That's fine. And for us, we'll presume we're new users. So go ahead and do all in one partition like it asked us. And you have to click yes to pretty much commit that you really meant to say yes to all those other things. And go ahead. This bears, again, this is not a Debian instruction video. It's an interesting topic here, but for now, we're going to just let it accept the default, which is pretty much the whole drive. It's going to allocate the whole drive for Debian. And once again, we're confirming, and it wants to confirm all these things because if you have something on this, in theory, if you had a hard drive that had something else on it, you're going to wipe it all out by doing this. But in this case, it's a virtual drive that we just made, so there's nothing on it anyway, so we're safe to wipe it all. Okay, so off it goes. This will take a while. Debian is light by many operating system standards, but there's still a number of things that it needs to install. So we will wait and stop the recording and resume when it's done with this. So after a while, your progress bar will complete, and you will get to this screen. And this screen is pretty much asking you, hey, you did like the core install. Are there other DVD images that you want to be looking at? For us, the answer is no. So that's what we're going to say, no. Now it's going to ask us, and I have to read this, it's been a while since I've seen this screen. Network mirror can be used. Are you installing from it even though it contains a connection? Use a network mirror. And we do want to use a network mirror because as we do have the DVD image. We're going to keep the DVD image, but this way, if you change your mind, you want to get rid of the DVD image, you can. And the system, it wouldn't complain very much before, but it won't complain at all, or hardly at all, if you specify this after removing the DVD image after finishing the install. And this one's new to me. Perhaps I just blew by it before. It wants to know where on the internet to look for pretty much configuration of further installation within the VM. And of course, I'm in the United States. That's what I'm going to choose. I'm sure if you choose one local to you, that's the way to do it. And yeah, I'm going to go with the default. Pretty much if you don't know which one to choose here, choose the default. And proxies are nifty. I don't have one. And if you do have one, you're probably at a corporate workspace somewhere. So you might have to pause if you really think you have a proxy to get the proxy information. I don't, and that would be beyond the scope of this video to go into how to configure a proxy. So we're going to continue forward here with no proxy. Now, APT is Debian's preferred mechanism by which to do further installs of software once your root Debian is installed. And we will be doing that a little bit later in the video. But long story short, it's preferred not to go to through Firefox and do like a manual download like you do with Windows or something. It's preferred for you to get new software via this APT mechanism because the Debian Foundation themselves verify. It's a little like Windows Store, right? They verify exactly what you're downloading and ensure that it's got as few bugs and as few security vulnerabilities as as their verification process says. And there's one downside, which is Debian tends to be a little behind. They don't have the latest versions of everything because it takes them time to go through that verification. But for me, like 99% literally of the time, I prefer the comfort and safety of well-working software versus having that one extra feature that the new one provides. And then this one's up to you, whether you want to give anonymous statistics for how you're using the installations. I'm just going to say yes, but it's really up to you. It doesn't matter as far as the ability to do development in the VM. Now, this is a particularly interesting page because what we're getting to is the end of the install. We've already got Core Debian installed now, but now what it's saying is, well, you probably don't want just a text console. You probably want a graphical interface because, as most people know, Unix and Linux, their core system doesn't need a graphical interface. It can be all text, and it's part of its charm. But in our case, we definitely want a graphical interface. There's no need to be that hardcore about it. I prefer LXQT. That's just what I like to use. I don't think it's going to make a whole lot of difference in so far as using the development tools. So choose the one you like. This tutorial will be sticking to LXQT. You want the standard system utilities, and importantly, this is you really want SSH server, and we'll get into what that is a little bit later. So hit continue, and now it's going to go through yet another install phase. The previous one was core Debian, the most minimal Debian that will boot up. And now it's installing these extra mechanisms like that SSH, like your graphical interface. So I'm going to pause the video here. So we are back, and you will see a completion page, and then you will see this installing the grub bootloader page. And you don't really have to think too much about the grub bootloader. Just know that it's an extra step for power users to manage advanced booting scenarios such as multiple operating systems, etc. That's not us, but we like grub, so we'll install it anyway. And then we do want to specify dev SDA. If you've been following the video exactly, you'll only have one drive and one partition, and that's the drive and partition on which Debian lives, and your screen will look like this. If you have multiples, you're going to want to have this on the boot drive. So now it's actually installing what we call the bootloader. And this is a nice step. This was not always the case, but now you can see it's installing OpenVM tools. It kind of flew by there. That is particularly useful for virtual machines, because virtual machines are exactly, it's a well-named feature slash product where it's a machine in a machine. And the OpenVM tools lets you do things like copy and paste from one virtual machine out of your virtual machine. Because otherwise, you could only copy and paste within that one machine, because that's how computers are. If you have 5 computers and you hit copy on one, you can't paste on the other one. This lets you kind of do that, span that gap. Installation is complete. It is time to boot your system. Yep, and that's what we're going to do, so we're good to go. This is what you want to see. You want to see the grub screen pop up like this. It has a little bit of a timeout, and then once it times out, it boots Debian proper. And this is not a particularly slow process when things are working the way we want them to work, when they quote-unquote should be working. For me, in this particular environment, the first boot will be a little slower than average. That's just how my environment is. Everybody's environment will be different. And this is what you expect to see, a whole bunch of very technical descriptions of all the pieces of Debian starting up here. This is all expected. All looks good. Excellent. This is what you want to see. We now have our Debian desktop pretty much ready to go for first-time use. And then it'll even tell you, hey, you've got LXQT installed. In theory, you could actually have multiples. That's kind of a power user thing. We're not going to do that, but it's cool that you can. And I'm going to put in name and your password. And you may recall from earlier in the video, I used a terrible password, Debian, just because I'm making a video. You put in your better password and your name here. Or if you chose a username other than your name, that username. And this is what we want to see, this desktop. And yeah, Debian, when it's on a VM, is pretty cautious. It's like, hey, you know, your power management might need some attention and stuff. You can ignore those messages for a virtual machine. And this is the place we want to be. We're back at the desktop where we want to be. So we want to install a few items like MDNS, but before we can do that comfortably, we could do it, but we want to do it comfortably. And to comfortably do it, we want to add your non-privileged user to what we call the sudoer group. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but that's the way I've always said it. Sudo is a super user doing something. And we like that separation. That separation from your non-privileged user to a privileged user lets you do all kinds of things generally as a non-privileged user without having to worry about, you know, accidentally erasing something or downloading a virus and installing it on your computer. It's a safety measure. And Debian does it by default, and that's what we're logged in as. But because of that, we're not able to as easily do admin level things. So we're going to kind of bridge that gap. And what we're going to do is we're going to add our current user, in my case being me, Malachi, to the sudoer group as mentioned. So there's a few steps to do that. The first thing you have to do is you have to temporarily switch over to root admin access. So the way we're going to do that is SU for super user. You're going to hit enter, and it's going to prompt you for the initial root password that I asked you for during the install earlier, one of the two passwords that I said use a good password for. In my case, I used a terrible password for both, Debian, D-E-B-I-A-N. Now I am root instead of Malachi user. And for the record, this doesn't work so well if you're trying to log in through the graphical interface that you saw earlier, the initial login screen. It doesn't really want to let you log in as root, so this is really the way you need to do it. So what we want to do now is we want to add the current user, Malachi, or whatever your username is, the non-privileged user, to the sudo user group. And to do that, you have to very explicitly tell it where that user modification command is. The reason for that is because we didn't fully log in as root in the beginning, it doesn't give us all the niceties to find all the root tools, but we do have access to them. So here's what you do. You type in /usr/sbin, and then you type usermod for modify user, -a for add, -g to add to a group. You're going to add the sudo group as mentioned, and then you're going to specify the username. My username is Malachi. Okay? Now what has happened is you have given your user the opportunity to enter admin mode, but still be you. And this is great for accountability reasons. If you're ever like, well, how did that get messed up? And you look at the logs, instead of just a generic root, it'll be your username. And that, as you can imagine, is pretty useful for if you have multiple users and other, accountability concerns. So what we can do now is effectively in a new terminal. Let's go back to this old guy, and just to prove the point, we are no longer root. We're regular user again. And we will say sudo, and I like -s, which pretty much goes into, an interactive mode. And you'll type in your regular user password. And right, you have to log back out and log back in again for this to work. That always gets me. And it'll probably get you too, because you followed this video. One more time. We are attempting to temporarily elevate our regular user to super user access. And here we go. And I just noticed something that I just never really noticed. It does say root here, so I'm of the mind that everything really is attached to your user, but I could be wrong about that. I could be wrong, but that's what I'm of the mind of. So if somebody wants to clarify that for me, please do. Please do. With all that said, we are now at the point where we are more comfortable doing a few more installs in the system. And so that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to install the MDNS, call it, feature. And what this feature does, as I alluded to earlier, it makes this particular virtual machine easier for other machines, virtual or otherwise, to find you on the network. In Debian, the name of your MDNS subsystem is called Avahi. That's kind of like the product name for the MDNS technology. And specifically, the way we'll install it, and this will become old hat to anybody who uses Debian, is you'll type apt, which is the Debian package manager, comes with all Debians, install. And then in this particular instance, the name of this tool is Avahi, just like that, daemon. Daemon being the very old name for server. And it turns out that is already installed with Debian, so that's great. We are good to go. We can now move on to the step of externally accessing this virtual machine, so that the convenience of not having to log into Debian on the virtual machine itself is present. This is kind of a feature of Linux systems. So there's a number of ways you can do this. Windows actually has, if Windows 10 onward, has a built-in what we call SSH client. SSH bearing its own video once again, but for the short term, think of SSH as the Linux and Unix preferred mechanism by which to remotely access other Unix and Linux machines. Secure shell. And that's why we selected it from the beginning, because we want to do these remote access things. So Windows has a secure shell client on its command line, but I prefer a particular product called MobaXterm. We are now at the point where we are ready to install SSH client into Windows. As mentioned before, Windows does have a baked-in SSH client, but this is worlds better. The people at MobaXterm have done an incredible job, and it would take a whole other video just to talk about all the great things that this software does. So suffice to say, I highly recommend it, and I'm going to show you the process for using it in this environment. Go ahead and navigate to mobaxterm.mobatech.net. Go to your download. We'll be doing the free one. And portable or installer work, we'll do the installer edition for this example. So go ahead and wait for it to download. Now that it's downloaded, go through pretty standard procedure. Extract out the zip file. And it will have an installer in there. You'll double click on the installer, and nothing particularly eventful here. Just accept the defaults. Yep. Click finish, and then you will run mobexterm from your start menu, and it will look something like this. Chances are you'll get a firewall permissions pop up. You will want to grant that because mobexterm is very much a networking piece of software and requires that access. From here, what you're going to want to do is create a session, and this session will be a secure shell session to connect to our virtual machine. So what you'll do is you'll type in the name of the virtual machine we made earlier, Debian.esp, and be sure to include .local. That is the MDNS convention that assists the computers finding one another. And I always like to specify a username. There's probably a better way to do it, but this works for me. I type in the username that we, again, created earlier in our Debian VM. And at this point, you can hit OK. And it's going to give you some security questions. Again, this is going to be a common theme when you use Secure Shell. It's very cautious, as it should be. However, in this case, this is a local network, and we know who we're connecting to, so we can click Accept. At this point, I'm going to type in that same terrible password from earlier, Debian. Not going to save it. And now we are logged in a effectively remote control kind of situation. Secure Shell is a remote terminal into our virtual machine. In addition to the textual remote interface that Secure Shell provides at its core, there is a very interesting capability, which more or less amounts to remote graphical interface as well. Technically, that's the X Windows or X Server mechanism. To demonstrate this, I will use basically a notepad type of app that is built into LXQT's GUI framework on top of Debian, and that's called Featherpad. So I will type in Featherpad, then I'll type in test2.txt, and what has popped up within my Windows desktop, you will observe that behind us the virtual machines are still effectively minimized. So this is remarkably on the Windows desktop, but this is actually a graphical element. This entire interface is truly running within the virtual machine. Very cool stuff. So I can, hello world, I can say that. I'll close this, and then what I will do is I'll do an ls, and you will see now there's a new file there that I just made, and as you would expect, hello world is in there. I'm a very big fan of this, and this capability extends to all kinds of environments such as Sea Lion. You can do VS Code in it, although it goes a little slow, and VS Code has its own remote features, which, again, that's a different video. But by and large, it's a very powerful feature, and I personally get a lot of mileage out of it. Next up, there are conditions that you will probably encounter at some point where this MDNS, the .local portion, doesn't quite work as expected. Windows, in particular, seems to sometimes be inconsistent there, especially in my experience when you're using a Wi-Fi. So what I like to do sometimes for very frequently used virtual machines, sometimes I'll make a second session, and I will in particular use the IP address. So what we can do is, there's a number of ways we can do this. I'm going to log into the VM directly here. By logging directly into the VM, if you are in the circumstance where MDNS is not quite working right and it's not able to do the remote session, then you can always go straight in, because using the VM directly naturally doesn't require network access. You're, in effect, directly on the machine. And then what you can do is you can look up your IP address directly right here. I like to use IPA, lots of ways to do it. Copy the selection, and then we'll pop back out to mobexterm, and we can put that IP address in here. And we'll go ahead and specify our username again, just like before. And accept just like before. And password just like before. And at this point, we effectively have two nearly identical sessions, but you'll observe that one of them is directly using the IP and one of them is using the MDNS. So to summarize, we do prefer the MDNS one. You are recommended to start with that, but if it's just not working out for you, the IP is what you're going to need to do. We are finally at the point where we are ready to install Espressif's SDK. It's a C/C++ based SDK called ESP-IDF. What I recommend you do a Google search for ESP-IDF Get Started. You will likely land up here, docs.espressif.com, projects, ESP-IDF, latest. We don't want the latest. I always recommend picking a particular version. At this time, 5.1.1 is their newest release and has been passing all my tests, so that's the one we're going to use. You'll scroll down a bit, and then we're going to go to manual installation for Linux and Mac OS. There are some very compelling plugins and extensions for Eclipse and VS Code. We won't be covering that. We're going to be doing the more low-level command line. At this point, you can observe 5.1.1 is right on their documentation line here, and that's consistent with Espressif's documentation. They really put in a solid effort to disambiguate the behaviors of different versions of their system via this drop-down, and you will see it reflected here. Well done, Espressif. Not everybody does that. Step 1, install prerequisites. For Linux users, that's us, Ubuntu and Debian. This is the one we want, so we're going to copy that. What we're going to do is we're going to go back to MOBA Xterm. We're going to elevate our user, because installs typically need that. I'm going to go ahead and paste in what we just copied from that website. There are going to be many packages that this is going to install, so you can expect this step to take a bit of time. Now the packages have completed their installation. Our next step will be to do a git clone of the ESP-IDF repository. And for the uninitiated, Git is a powerful source control system, definitely deserving of its whole own suite of videos, truth be told. We will just try to keep it succinct here and say that Git in this context is used to retrieve the SDK from the internet. Now let us do that. So we'll scroll down. We're going to go to our step 2. So I deviate slightly from this. I don't put the ESP-IDF in this particular folder. I'll show you what I do. So we're going to copy this. We don't need to be a super user anymore for this next step. And I always put my own projects into a projects folder, like so. And within this, external projects that I am not writing, other people are creating and managing, I put into ext folder. Clearly you can do your own thing. However, I've gotten a lot of mileage out of this approach over the years. It keeps things pretty clear. And now we paste in the git clone statement from the website back here. Similar to the previous apt install, this step is also going to take a while. It's quite a big repository and it's many years old, so there's quite a bit of history. Okay, after a while we have finally finished cloning that repository and all its sub-modules. We are at step 3 to set up the tools. And this is what I think of as the true install of ESP-IDF. And we have this install bash script right here. And they have a parameter ESP32. Now, I never use that parameter. So frankly, I can't really comment with authority how that behaves when you do it. What I do is I leave that parameter off, which appears to install all the ESP32 target variants. That always works for me. And that's what I recommend, and that's what we're going to do. So we're going to go back over here, and we have to change directory into the one we just cloned, ESP-IDF. And similar to the step 3 instruction, we're going to do our install.sh. And as mentioned, we're going to do no parameters. And once more, some downloading, and this will take some time too, probably a little faster than the previous two downloads, but still will take some time. Now that we're done with that install script, your screen should look something like this. With this all done, you can now run export.sh. And that's what we will do now. And if that runs without any incident, you can rest assured that you now have a complete core installation of ESP-IDF SDK. An additional step we can take that's pretty easy is we can verify whether the ESP-IDF toolchain itself is behaving as we want it to. This is not too difficult. We can go to their examples area, and we can go to Get Started, and we'll go to Hello World. And the operation we're about to do here does not require an ESP32 part at all. We are only verifying that the software is reaching that last mile where it's building the firmware image. So what we'll do is we'll type idf.py space build. You will become very familiar with that command. And you will see the regular CMake detection and then a familiar build type of a process. It will build quite a few files because, as is customary for firmware, you tend to rebuild all the C files from time to time. Now we've finally completed that process. If your screen looks like this, with this large line ending in IDF-PY port flash, then you have a successful build. It will be pretty obvious if you don't have a successful build. You probably get a bunch of red errors. At this point, this marks the completion of our SDK configuration and installation. I will show you one last optional step that I configure for all of my workstations. It helps me in my productivity. What I like to do is set up a helper script, in effect, to make it easier to run that export process you saw earlier. And it does a few other nice things as well. So we'll run our FeatherPad again, and I like to call it setenv ESP32. You can name it whatever you like. And just to help bash along, you tell it that it is a bash script. And then use source, which is effectively the dot command. And then we do one extra thing. I find this to be really helpful. ESP-IDF supports Ccache, and Ccache, long story short, really can help your compilations go a lot faster. It takes a bit of extra drive space. I have a feeling you have that drive space, so I recommend you do it. And then, of course, you got to change your mode of this file. To the executable. We'll run this in a new session so we don't get any false positives. So type in dot, just like before with the export, but now you type in setenv ESP32 right from your login, right when you log in. And it's going to set it all up just the same way. And just to verify that really it did work, we'll go back to the example code that we were running earlier, or compiling, I should say, earlier. We'll go to Get Started and Hello World, and we'll run the IDF-PY build just once more. And if you're fast, you'll see it says ESP-IDF cache enable equals 1. And once again, it's going to go through the compilation process, and the first time it doesn't know that it was cached because we just turned on the cache. But next time, this step will go quite a bit quicker. We now have a complete baseline virtual machine from which we can compile our ESP-IDF projects. I hope this was helpful to you. I've gone through it many times, and each time it goes a little more smoothly, and I really hope that it helped you. Have a great day, and thank you for watching.